Chapter 46. Most of the nation's attention is currently fixed upon the escalating use of the drug P, or methamphetamine, in New Zealand. The drug is unusual in the speed at which the person takes the drug and then the drug takes the person. The ferocity of the personality changes that are wreaked on susceptible individuals can be frightening to behold, and the reach of the drug's use and distribution networks are ever deepening into our communities. Addiction is a powerful physical and psychological demand that worms its way into the core of a person's being and sets about to destroy that person's spirit and personality. With P, the addiction appears to take hold rapidly and dramatically. With cannabis, this process is generally slower and initially more difficult to recognise. Eventually, though, with any addictive drug use, regardless of what the drug is, the results will be more or less the same. Every dimension of that person's being will become tainted in some way. It's a difficult process for a non-addict to understand. After all, we look pretty defective towards the end of our using lives, not much of an advertisement for the happy-go-lucky face of recreational drug use. So why can't we just stop once the party's over? When I first started going back to recovery meetings, I would share about how cannabis had become a ball and chain around my ankle. The fun had long since gone. I felt like I couldn't function without it. In the early days, I'd loved the feeling of freedom that drugs gave me, but now I was in more shackles than I ever imagined possible. I smoked dope just to feel normal, but it didn't make me normal, far from it. And I'd always believed the lie I told myself, that I would be worse off if I quit, that I couldn't be happy or indeed cope with life without dope. Happy? I wanted to kill myself. You can't get much more unhappy than that. Denial is that thick. Is it crazy to call a cannabis addiction life-threatening? Different people react differently to the drug. Be your own judge. It can certainly be soul-destroying. For me, getting clean felt like it had become a matter of life and death. I reflect on all the near misses that I survived, near car accidents where I could have been killed, the life-sucking demons of depression and insanity that may well have led to suicide sooner or later. The fact that my drug use had become increasingly risky and that I would take whatever was put in my hand. I'm probably not being too melodramatic when I say that the odds of me failing to see out my natural years were stacking up. I began to see that I could not stay clean unless I was also managing the symptoms of the bipolar. The addiction and the mental illness had their tentacles wrapped tightly around each other. I know not what caused what came first, but it hardly mattered now. There is a powerful dynamic between these dual forces, which cannot be broken by merely looking at one or other of these malevolent beasts. When my bipolar was in its active phases, highs or lows, using drugs was intricately wound up in this. When I was high, the added euphoria attained from using drugs as well was intoxicating and highly addictive. When I was depressed and haunted by demons, smoking dope and drinking were the things I relied upon to bring relief. Receiving medical treatment for the mood disorder helped me reach a place of at least some emotional stability, where I was not so much at the mercy of the mood swings. When I was ready to quit, that little foretaste of stability made the idea of being clean from dope seem vaguely possible. Being stoned had for years given me the numbness and emotional distance I needed to live with my thoughts, feelings and fears. Socially, where I had always felt that I was so different from everyone else, an alien who had accidentally landed on this strange planet, when I was stoned, I either didn't feel it or just didn't care. Even though mentally and emotionally smoking dope was making things worse, I didn't see it like that. Anyway, by this point the physical aspect of addiction had taken hold, and the cravings would not allow me to let it go even if I wanted to. In those last few months of active addiction, I smoked dope every 2 or 3 hours just to appease the hungry beast. I was virtually never straight. Every time I took a deep toke on that joint, I was sucking all the colour from my existence. And every day was the same, grey. That is not the colour of spiritual health and well-being. That would be more like a rainbow. Addiction, like mental illness, is a sickness. It is a progressive disease that in time eats away at the piles of every one of those cornerstones like a ravenous termite. Left untreated, the addiction and the results get worse. But the treatment for this disease is not medical. There is no pill to cure addiction. And let's face it, if there was, we'd probably just overdose on it anyway. The solutions lie in the spiritual realm. We must find a way to fill that bottomless inner void with something life-affirming, or we shall surely go down. If we can identify and tend lovingly what is good in ourselves and good in the world, we move towards the higher plane of the contented spirit. We can cease being mercilessly ravaged by the lower power of addiction and her handmaidens. By the time we got home from the camping trip, I was 5 days clean. I was shaky, but I was doing it. My assurances that I would go back to recovery meetings had temporarily salvaged my family relationships, but it was time for more than words. Only action could deliver me now. I will never forget the sense of relief that fell over me when I sat down in that first 12-step meeting, 7 years after my previous visits. And something uncanny, there were only 3 or 4 people in the room. I was expecting total strangers. But one of them was someone that I recognised, someone I had crossed paths with years ago in another city, another life. She was surprised but delighted to see me, and that smoothed my passage into the room. I think of that as my first spiritual awakening within the group. I looked at her so shiny and clean, so different from when I had last seen her as a thin, gaunt heroin addict working the ships, and suddenly I wanted whatever she was having. I don't believe that this was just some happy coincidence. To me it was the miracle I needed to get me to sit down, listen and take heed. That first meeting I mainly cried and shook. I really didn't know what to say. I felt so beaten, so old and wrecked. I was only 33, but I felt as though I had nothing left. There was no more fight in me, not against the drugs. But in that room that day, I felt the weight of the world lifted from my shoulders. Those people welcomed me with a rough but real, genuine love. They held out the hand of friendship, the light of hope, and a meetings list and some phone numbers to go with it. I was no longer alone in the pit, and no matter what I'd done, no matter how unmanageable my life had become, I was back amongst people who'd been there too, and better still, who knew how to change. It was time to let them show me how to help myself.